Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Mara's virtual update on contaminated sites. We're glad you guys could all join us. Hopefully we have some useful information to share with you today. Presenting for us from Hemera, we have Jason Wilkins, a Vice President of the BC Yukon region, Carrie Dow, Business Leader of Site Assessment and Remediation in BC, Matt Beveridge, also a Business Leader over in Alberta, Trevor Jansen, our Director of Land Development in Ontario, and I'm Melanie Wilson, a Project Manager in our BC office, and I'll be moderating. On our next slide here, you can see the distribution of Hemera staff across the country, including staff stationed in the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. So during our presentation, you'll hear from staff in BC, Alberta, as well as Ontario. On our next slide, there's a good visual showing the distribution of projects across the country that our team has worked on. You can see the green dots on the map on the right there. So it's just kind of a cool visual that we like to share. So on our next slide, before we get started, I'll just give you a quick overview of what you can expect coming up. Carrie and Jason in BC will be discussing the regulatory updates, including changes to the site profile system and what you need to consider for your master plan projects. In Alberta, Matt Beveridge will be discussing some innovative remediation strategies. And in Ontario, it's all about excess soils. So Trevor will walk us through how to tame the Brat, so stay tuned on that. There will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the next hour. So when we pause for questions, you're welcome to type them into the Q&A chat box and I can read them out. Or if you just want to put up your hand, we can unmute you and you can ask your question. So to get things started, I'll pass things over to Jason.
Thanks, Mel. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the changes in the site profile process that are currently amendments for February 21st, 2021 to the Contaminated Sites regulation in BC. Next slide, please. So currently under the site profile process, anyone can fill it out to the best of their knowledge. So going forward, what they've basically said is that now they're calling it a site disclosure statement. So it's not much different than it used to be, other than it needs to be filled out by a designated agent of the owner or the owner themselves. So they want someone who's knowledgeable of the site to fill it out. And of course, if it's somebody that's not knowledgeable, then you probably have to have an extra letter that says that you're allowing somebody else to fill it out. So not a real significant change there, just making sure the right people are providing the right information. There are, however, some new exemptions that are relevant from a developer perspective. So currently, when you do a site profile and it goes to the ministry, if it triggers a site investigation through the municipal permitting process, you would have to seek a special release for rezoning or subdivision or minor lot changes, etc. So that's a lot of paperwork, and they've realized that that's not really necessary. So for the most part, they're basically saying that any minor lot changes, so rezoning or subdivision that doesn't impact the Schedule 2 use on your site that is the reason for the delay, is not going to require a release. It'll be automatically released. That process will be managed through the municipality. There'll be no need to get a special letter. If you're just doing a rezoning or a subdivision, or if your your building or development scenario involves limited installation or replacement of underground utilities, fencing, signage, paving, or landscaping are also exempt. So they're making it a little bit easier, but that doesn't mean that you won't have to go through your scenario 3, 4, and 5 releases if you're actually doing a redevelopment project. What they've also said is that you don't have to wait for that letter. What they've done is they've simplified the form. There's no longer yes or no answers. Very simply, in your site disclosure statement, if you have a Schedule 2 activity, you are automatically triggered into the site investigation process. Again, just to streamline the process, you'll know when you write a Schedule 2 activity on that site disclosure statement that site investigation will be required. And then, of course, they've added some area where there's penalties associated with filling it out incorrectly or, I guess, being dishonest. And that's one of the changes relative to who they want filling it out. Although those penalties, they haven't specified what they are. They just basically are introducing powers allow them to add penalties. Next slide, please. The most expansive changes is the Schedule 2 uses. What they've basically done is they've added shipping and handling to most of the commercial industrial activities, which really doesn't change much. It's just a clarification. It was somewhat assumed historically if you're manufacturing or you're storing this material, you're probably shipping and handling it. So they've added that in there, which really doesn't change anything. They've added some clarifications that are very useful for people that own portfolio sites. When you do the phase 1 and you have a generator on your site and you have a fuel tank associated with that, or an elevator with oils for the elevators, they basically added those in there as not Schedule 2 activities. They basically clarified that and said those are not Schedule 2 activities. So that's good. So it makes it a little bit easier. Those risks, there was some confusion around that, certainly around mobile fuel storage as well. So those have been completely removed, makes it a little bit easier going forward. But what they've also added is contaminated fill material. Now, historically, when you do these phase 1 environmental site assessments, you may get a clause in there that says there's a potential for fill of unknown origin. That is not a Schedule 2 activity. And as near as we can tell, based on these changes, it is not a Schedule 2 activity and now either, or it won't be in February. But what they have said is that if this soil is contaminated, it is a Schedule 2 activity. So this is very important. I think it's a very substantive change to the Schedule 2 uses. You need to be very mindful in the future when you have sites with fill to make sure that you're sampling it appropriately. So definitely don't sample fill material unless you absolutely have to, because it may trigger further work when you go through your development stage. Next slide. And one of the other main changes that have happened is historically there were 42 municipalities that had opted out of this process, most notably Coquitlam, as it's mentioned there, but also the township of Langley. So they had their own process for managing whether or not you're a contaminated site through the development process, and that was completely allowed. There was exemptions for them to opt out. You're no longer allowed. So it levels the playing field. Every municipality in the province needs to go through this process, and you will be triggered into this process in no matter where you're doing your development work. And then also First Nations land are federally not subject to the BC CSR, but some treaty lands have adopted the site profile process. So you just need to be aware of that if you're doing development work on some treaty lands, that you may also have to fill out the site profile. Next slide. So one other major change that Carrie Dow is going to talk about is master plan developments and some of the changes associated with the site profile process.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So those changes sound pretty manageable. So a few more sites will potentially be captured as Schedule 2 uses, but there's more exemptions to completing the new site disclosure form, and the patchwork requirements in opted out municipalities has been eliminated. So I just wanted to, I'm going to try to share my video here, but I'm having some computer challenges, so I apologize if this doesn't work. But yeah, okay, here we go. So the change that I'm going to talk about is an interesting one in that we're not entirely sure how this particular change is going to be implemented or how firm the Ministry of Environment or ENV is going to be. So hidden in one of the sections of the 2019 ENV policy intentions paper are two sentences about high-risk sites and multi-phase developments. So the first sentence clearly states that multi-phase developments and high-risk sites will no longer be eligible for a Scenario 5 release. So the second sentence is a little bit ambiguous in that it says an approval in principle or an AIP is recommended, but it doesn't clearly state it's required. So the challenge here is that the guidance for releases, so this is the Administrative Guidance 6 or AG6, hasn't been updated yet. So it's not entirely clear how this, how firm this new policy will be. So what's a high-risk site anyways? So high-risk sites are typically the nasty ones. They have high levels of contamination. And that contamination is typically either discharging directly into a receiving environment like a creek or something like that. So example, a gas station or an old bulk plant, you've got basically free product in the ground flowing into the local creek or ditch or something like that. Or you've got vapors. That's probably the more common one is vapors getting into a building. So those are your high-risk sites. And then I don't know that I need to explain multi-phase developments to this group, but obviously those are your master plan developments, like the photos shown on this slide. So if you're involved in a contaminated site like this, here's what this change means for you. So based on our recent experience, you'll still be able to obtain the AG6 Scenario 2 release for your upfront permits. So these are sites like the opposite of what Jason was talking about, where there's a simple lot line adjustment, no effect on the Schedule 2, where you are doing a redevelopment that affects a Scenario 2 release. You will still be eligible for a release for those upfront permits like rezoning and subdivision. This is really important as it allows you to proceed with the planning and achieve the preliminary approvals from the various city councils so that you have certainty your project will be approved before you commit to the bigger environmental costs. So that's important. That's essentially not changing. However, that last permit before construction, so depending on the municipality you're in, that's either a development permit or a building permit, it will not be eligible for a Scenario 5 release anymore, and instead you'll require an AIP. Okay, so how does that affect project cost? So the investigation work, so this is your preliminary and detailed site investigation work, the remediation plan, and a risk assessment if you're planning to leave any contamination in place. Those must be substantially completed and fully drafted for submission to a contaminated site approved professional sort of CSAP, or to the Ministry of Environment upfront right away. This obviously adds an upfront cost in comparison to a Scenario 5 release, where the reports don't have to be fully drafted. But the reality is that you would have to complete these reports at some point anyways, so it really just changes when the costs are incurred rather than increasing the costs significantly. There's really only one small extra cost, and that's for the AIP application itself. So what about schedule? So this is where the key impact lies, in my opinion. So having to obtain an AIP upfront means you have to have all your work completed upfront. And that means you need to build time into your schedule for this. It can easily add several months or more to the upfront schedule. And then because an AIP is a full-blown Ministry of Environment instrument, it is subject to a 1 in 8 random performance assessment, or audit, as we sometimes call it. And if you've ever been through one of those, you know it can also add several months or more to the schedule. So the moral of the story here is for your high-risk sites or your master plan communities, make sure you factor in more upfront costs and plan this into your schedule well in advance, with lots of contingency on the schedule side of things. Next slide, please, Carol. All right. So there's a few other little changes that I wanted to highlight that are actually already in effect. So the one window approach is something that's fairly new for Ministry of Environment. Historically, if we had an oddball situation or we needed to get a regulator's opinion on an approach, we'd just call them up or we'd email them directly. There was a listing of which staff member was the lead on which topic. And well, the reality is we just all knew each other anyways. But in the last few years, there's been quite a bit of turnover at ENV. And now we have this list of 6 generic email addresses. And this is the only way to communicate with ENV. So our inquiries are now answered by a team of folks that are tasked with each of these 6 topics. And the idea is that similar inquiries are answered the same way each time, and the responses are tracked. So although we've lost a bit of timeliness and convenience, the benefit is fairness and confidence in the accuracy of the responses. So the other new policy that's already in place is this idea of first in, first out. So no longer are you able to make a case that your file is more urgent than others. You will just have to wait your turn. So this concludes our BC updates. So we're going to pause here for a quick 5-minute break to answer any BC specific questions before we move on to Alberta. There will also be an opportunity at the end to ask any additional questions. So yeah, so please either type your question into the Q&A, or just type in that you have a question and we'll unmute you and you can ask it out loud. It's up to you.
Carrie, we have one question here that's come up. So the question is whether or not there is a timeline for the new guidance documents you and Jason were talking about.
That's a great question. Nothing has been formally announced in terms of a timeline, but obviously with that February 1st, 2021 deadline where this all becomes effective is looming, it's going to come quick. I expect to see something really, really soon. One thing that ENV has said is that they are already out doing workshops and training sessions with those formerly opted out municipalities, so that hopefully they hit the ground running when they start receiving site profiles in February.
One other question here. Can you clarify what clients should be doing now? Adding fill as a concern will increase the scope of investigations. So Jason, maybe for you.
I can answer that. Well, yes and no. It's another great question. I mean, having fill material added to the schedule to activity, it's not specifically clear. If I read Schedule 2 the way it's being proposed, it's suggesting that the fill material needs to be contaminated and essentially stored on the site. So if you've imported fill on the site back in 1910 and it's contaminated, only once you've sampled it is considered a Schedule 2 activity. So there are certainly, if you've already have fill on your site, you've already sampled it, and it turns out it's contaminated, you've got a Schedule 2 activity come February 21st, 2021, unfortunately. But what I would suggest is that, as you go forward with these sites, either on the purchasing or the selling or the redevelopment phase, is to just be mindful of the fact that you have fill on your site and work with your consultant to figure out whether or not you need to sample it, should be sampling it, and if you are, what you're sampling it for. Because as soon as it becomes contaminated, you might be held up. So, if I had a site personally with fill material on it and I knew it might be an issue, that historical fill, you only have to deal with it from lot line to lot line. You don't have to go off site because you didn't place it there. So maybe just what might be an issue and you have a contingency for dealing with that when the time comes, but just make sure when the time comes is after you apply for permits.
Awesome, thanks, Jason. Last call for questions if anyone has any. Let's see if there's any hands up or anything. No. Okay, I think that's it for questions. And there will be opportunity to ask more at the end as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt Beveridge in Alberta.
All right, hello everyone. So the talks in Alberta and BC are focused around regulatory changes. We haven't had any in 2020 changes to the regulations in Alberta, so I'm not going to be talking on that and instead focus on some innovative approaches to remediation that we're taking on a project site here in the city of Calgary for a copper plume. So next slide, please. So the site itself is a former industrial property that's been converted to a very active commercial property. What we have there is a source zone that's inaccessible. Want to go to the next point, please? And we've got a little bit of a schematic here with a copper plume. As a note too, we also have a fertilizer plume that we're doing some innovative testing on remediation, but I'm going to just focus on copper today. If you do have any questions about fertilizer or any type of nutrients, we can have a conversation afterwards perhaps. But the main driver for this is that we do have groundwater flow that's discharging into a freshwater aquatic receiving body. So AEP, or Alberta Environment and Parks, has reached out to our client and made it known that this is unacceptable. And the modeling of this has shown that over the next 1,000 years, the copper plume and the discharge concentrations are going to continue to increase into this freshwater aquatic body. Next point on the slide, please. Yeah, next point as well. Next one. So what we've done on site is that we've tailored our remediation and our plume treatment to be in situ. So as I mentioned, it's a very active commercial property. We've got buildings, we've got a major intersection, and we've got lots of utilities throughout the copper source zone, as well as down gradient of it. So we've taken this and we've gone from a phase 1, which was a bench scale test, showing the methodology and the technology will work. And we've gone into a phase 2 pilot scale testing on site. And then right now, currently, we have people on site doing phase 3, which is the full scale remediation of the property. Next slide, please. And so just a little bit of an overview on kind of phase 1, phase 2. I won't get into too many of the technical details, but again, if you would like to discuss these more, or you're interested in groundwater geochemistry, feel free to give me a call afterwards. But what we're using here is we're doing in situ injections of an iron source, so a ferrous iron, and we're oxidizing it, causing it to precipitate out as what's called hydroferric oxide, or HFO. And this HFO is just acting as a sink for the copper in groundwater. So the copper is just sticking to the exterior of this HFO, removing it from the plume as the water flows through. So this picture here is just showing our phase 1 bench scale testing. Each of these columns had different concentrations of HFO to determine what was the optimal concentration of HFO. And we also have a control, which is the one on the far right. So you'll see the first 3 are quite orange. That's due to the iron precipitating out. The one on the far right is a control where we didn't add any iron. But we used aquifer material from the site, so solid material, and we also use groundwater from the source zone for these testing to determine what was the appropriate concentration. If you want to click the next button. And this is our pilot scale testing. So what we did is, as I mentioned, lots of infrastructure. It's an active commercial property. So we had to go out at night, and to make this feasible, we drilled wells and we injected into these wells. So you can see our schematic is we inject the iron, we inject our oxidant, which then creates the HFO. And then we have down gradient wells monitoring for the iron plume, with further wells for potential oxidation if required. The main concerns on this site is that it's an alluvial aquifer with cobbles and boulders, and groundwater flow naturally is at 1 meter a day. And so having control on this plume was quite the challenge. But we came up with some innovative techniques on how we could control that and how we could limit the potential issues of an iron plume being added to our copper plume. So next slide, please. Our results that we found from pilot is greater than 80% removal of copper down gradient of our injection. So if you can click, we've got a figure that'll show some of our plumes. Next button too. So here's our site. We've got our injection, which are the blue wells, and then our orange wells are all of our monitoring down gradient. And you'll see where we have dark green is a greater than 80% removal of dissolved copper from groundwater. And off to the side, so a bit more cross gradient of groundwater flow, we're getting less reduction. So we saw up to 96% removal of copper in our pilot scale testing, which gave us assurances that, you know, we can implement this full scale and have, you know, good removal of copper to meet the AEP guideline, which is pretty low. Another benefit of this is that we did develop digital data collection forms, and this was a real benefit to the project. As the field team is on site collecting groundwater data, it's uploaded to a web portal, which you'll see on the left is a little bit of a chart showing some of the data as it's being collected during injection. So the project manager, myself, as well as some of the technical leads we have here, have access to this, and we could log in at any point in time and see what's happening on site. We can make a call to say, you know, we have an issue or we have a concern with what's going on. Can you please talk us through what's happening? So not only that, but this is something that we could make readily available to our clients so that you can also see what's happening in real time and how the project is going. So with that, it allowed us to really have really good control on the groundwater plume. As I mentioned earlier, natural flow is about 1 meter per day. And so when we're injecting under pressure, we're increasing that flow. So we didn't want to let this iron plume get away from us. So the visualization that we have here on the bottom left is showing a 5 meter down gradient well from where we injected, and then a 15 meter down gradient well just below that. And you'll see the kind of teal color blue is our dissolved oxygen. So that's our conservative tracer in water to see what's happening. And you'll see we have spikes of it, but we don't have much change in pH with metals chemistry. That's real important, that we're not allowing any other metals at a low pH to be released into water from what might be there. So we had a methodology developed and we showed that it worked. We were injecting and keeping that iron plume within, you know, 10 meters of our injection point. Next slide, please. So just some opportunities and benefits that have really come out of this is one thing that I like to have is it's an iterative approach. So we went from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and in the middle of all those, we also have additional groundwater sampling, monitoring ongoing, so that we can really inform not only the client, but the regulator and any of the other stakeholders involved, so that they can see what's happening and what's the best approach to move forward to solve this problem for our client. Next bullet, please. And so again, engagement is a key thing throughout the process. At the start of it, because this is a new technology, AEP was a little bit hesitant on it, especially given the fact that we had our freshwater aquatic receiving environment about 600 meters away from the source zone. But we worked through them, doing some tracer tests, doing some pump testing to show that when we inject the iron, we're not going to be staining this water body bright orange afterwards. And in fact, we actually injected about 20 meters from the high water mark of this water body, and we never saw anything arriving at the 15 meter down gradient well. So we had this methodology developed and our real-time data management with triggers showing that we could keep it in a smaller zone. Next point, please. And so one of the things is that we are injecting this, but it's not just limited to that. You know, if you're going through a redevelopment of your property and you have a metals plume, the HFO that we're using to sequester the copper can also be used on other potential metals such as selenium, molybdenum, maybe arsenic. You know, we can also use this into your development and design. So if you're excavating and you can't get your source zone, but you know that water's flowing through your excavation, you can mix your HFO at surface, place it down so it creates a permeable reactive barrier of sort to allow your water to be treated prior to leaving the site. So it's a benefit to have that ability to incorporate into your design. And then just the last point that I'd like to make is just that this is fully adaptable. We can choose different iron sources, we can choose different oxidants, we can design the injection well system or a permeable reactive barrier that really matches what's required for your site and for your end goal for the site. Is it a risk control or is it full remediation? We can talk through all of that. So just to give a little bit of overview on some of the stuff that we're doing here, and I hope that, you know, if you have any issues on your sites related to metals or anything else, that, you know, give us a call and we can talk through some of the options and how we can work that into remediating or at least controlling the risks on your site. Thank you.
I'll just put it out there. If anyone has any questions, you can put it in the Q&A chat here. We've got one question so far for you there, Matt. How did you control and mitigate any potential loss of the injected plume to prevent any additional issues?
So yeah, so as we went through this process, again, keeping it phased and iterative so that we're building our base of knowledge and our conceptual site model of the site, we did quite a number of hydrogeological testing. So the first phase of that was just placing some transducers in a triangle so that we can see what natural flow is and what the gradient is. Following up on that, we did some tracer testing in our injection and extraction wells so that we could develop our methodology before we got out there with the chemicals to make sure that we can pump and extract to make sure that we're not letting it get away. And then again, just the real-time data collection and that dashboard that we developed really allowed us, the people who sit in the office and are making these decisions for the field teams to know that, yeah, we are keeping an eye on everything and that we were leaving transducers in the wells well after injection was complete, just to make sure that that plume didn't migrate past what we expected it to do. So it was a combination of different testing and just, again, building on that knowledge to make sure that we know what's happening on site.
Awesome, thanks. Any other questions out there for Matt? All right, so we'll send it next to Trevor in Ontario.
Thanks, Melanie.
Yeah.
So this presentation is geared towards developers, what developers need to know and do. It answers the question, does Reg 406-19 on excess soils help developers? And also tries to provide some helpful tips for developers. Next slide, please. So this is what a lot of people are saying about the new reg because it is confusing. Next slide. Here's an overview of what developers need to know and do and the timing of the changes. Many of the changes already came into effect on July 1st, 2020, and I'd like to highlight some of these changes first. Reuse sites will be for beneficial purposes, such as backfill, final grading, landscaping, or site rehab. Other sites with instruments may have other requirements, like if you have an ECA or a CPU. The table lists some of the specific requirements for reuse of excess soils, such as dry soils only, final placement within 2 years, and a provision for reuse of SAR and EC impacted soils, typically from salting practices during the winter. Developers will be the project leader by definition, and liability for excess soil can no longer be passed on to general contractors or excavation subcontractors. The highlights on the soil bank storage and processing sites are there are class 1 sites, which are basically soil banks owned and operated by someone other than the project leader and under an ECA. It may sound weird, but I think of these as permanent, temporary sites. Soil is always coming in and going out, and class 1 sites are not under any volume or time restrictions. Whereas class 2 sites are temporary sites that are owned by the project leader. No ECA is required, but low risk processing activities are now activities are permitted, and only facilities with an ECA are permitted to accept and process liquid soils. Regarding the soil quality standards, so both generic and site-specific standards can be used for excess soil. The generic so there are 2 types of generic standards based on site volumes. For small volume sites, less than 350 meters cubed, the familiar Reg 153 Table 1 to 9 standards can be used, but for sites with excess soil greater than 350 meters cubed, the new excess soil volume independent generic standards Table 2.1 to 9.1 standards apply, and I'll talk a bit more about the new excess soil standards later. Site-specific standards can also be developed either using the beneficial reuse assessment tool, nicknamed the Brat, or a full risk assessment. I will talk more about the Brat later. Don't ask me why they picked an acronym that sounds like a misbehaving child. I don't know if it's an internal joke at the ministry or not. The planning requirements come into effect on January 1st, 2022. There's a lot of requirements, and this will take some efforts for QPs. I won't discuss all the requirements in detail, but I'll note that there's a notification requirement to the ministry for generation of greater than 2,000 meters cubed of excess soil. The other thing I'll highlight is that the amount of effort for planning is similar to phase 1 and 2 ESAs and sometimes more. Next slide, please. So there are 4 exemptions to the reg that I'd like to mention here. A grandfathering clause exempts existing contracts that are put in place before January 1st, 2021, but the exemption expires on January 1st, 2026. So your contracts people could become very busy until the new year if you want to try to postpone the effort to meet the new requirements. There's an exemption from assessment of past use requirements for stormwater management ponds, agricultural movements, and movement of RPI soils to non-agricultural sites, so residential parkland institutional soils to non-agricultural sites. There are also exemptions from the planning requirements for emergency work, like spills, for topsoil, and when less than 100 meters cubed of soil is transported directly to a waste disposal site, and for specific infrastructure projects. There's an exemption from the soil characterization requirements if soil is transported directly to a Class 1 soil management facility. There's also a couple of other timelines and triggers that you should be aware of. The landfilling restriction of disposal of excess soil that meets the Table 2.1 standards for residential parkland institutional use will begin on January 1st, 2025. Where assessment of past uses or enhanced investigation property identifies potential for contamination at the generator property, planning and characterization of soil must be completed regardless of the volume generated. This means that if past work identifies PCAs or apex on the property, or if the property is an advanced investigation property, common ones would include garages, gas stations, dry cleaners, and industrial properties, then the planning and soil testing activities specified in the reg must be completed even though the volumes are low. Next slide, please. So the Brat is an Excel-based tool that allows QPs to develop site-specific excess soil quality standards, leachate screening levels, and sealing values. The Brat allows for modification of 2 things: physical characteristics of a reuse site, like soil type, distance to surface water, hydraulic conductivity, depth of groundwater, etc., and site use characteristics similar to the modified generic risk assessment process, like shallow cap, fill and hard cap, building prohibitions, and different building scenarios. It also allows the use of leachate analysis as a pathway modifier because it assumes no groundwater characterization is done for excess soil. Let's look at the numbers for different development scenarios for the reuse site to help you understand the process and what it could mean for achieving your development objectives for your reuse sites. Here you can see the different standards on the right-hand side of the table. The Table 3 standard is 230, while the volume-independent Table 3.1 standard for excess soil is 26. It's often the case that the excess soil standards are lower than the Table 3 standards. In this case, soil to groundwater to aquatic life is a driving exposure pathway for the Table 3.1 value. Let's take a look at scenario 1 for the Brat. If we add site use characteristics under scenario 1, such as the distance to surface water and layout of excess soil, you can see that the Brat standard goes up to 210. Let's move on to scenario 2. If we add a building prohibition, the number increases to 260, but it's still below the maximum concentration of 400 found in our excess soil. So the soil would not be able to be reused at the site. Now let's move on to scenario 3. If you add a hard soil cap, and bingo, the number increases to 940, and the excess soil would now be acceptable under these site use characteristics. A couple other things. The QP is required to provide a copy of a signed declaration of the Brat, report to the local ministry office and the reuse site owner. A legal instrument issued by a public body is required under some circumstances, and if soil doesn't meet the Brat, you can either do a full risk assessment, which requires oversight from the ministry, or you can find another home that's suitable for the excess soil to be received. Next slide, please. The key benefits of Reg 406 to developers are increased clarity and well-defined process. An increase in front-end planning will streamline the process and save developers time in the long run. There should be more consistency in QP approaches. The industry will adjust and get used to optimizing the Brat, and eventually the process will become smoother. The planning requirements will require clearly defined site reuse locations, and hauling records will track soil destinations. This means reduced liability for developers because hauling record requirements will keep soil out of farmers' fields and other places that it should not be going. The key disadvantages are increased budgets from more time and effort for planning and coordination, higher soil characterization sampling costs, and increased complexity for developing and applying the standards for reuse sites. Liability remains with the developer. Developers can no longer pass on the liability of excess soil onto the general contractor or excavation subcontractors. And the other thing is that planning and tracking requirements will be onerous for small projects. Next slide, please. So yeah, helpful tips. It'll take some time for TPs to understand and apply consistently. The good news is that there's a lot of clarification documents coming out soon. 3 best practices guidance documents from ONIA and 10 fact sheets are coming out from the ministry on different topics. I believe there will be a competitive advantage for early adopters. Upfront planning will likely save money and reduce risk in the long run and result in fewer delays. Understanding the volume and quality of the soil to be managed will be key in identifying your strategic options. And for small volumes, this is important. For small volumes less than 350 meters cubed, excess soil could still be transferred between similar sites. Like if you have a table 3 site and you want to transfer it to a table 3 site, if it's under that exemption, then you can do that, but it won't work for volumes above that level. Contract language and specifications may need updating to reflect the new regulations and the fact that the liability remains with the project leader. And properties of soil are just as important as environmental quality in assessing reuse options. So that's it for me. I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions related to excess soil.
Thanks, Trevor. If there are any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. While people are coming up with their questions, we do actually have a question from Matt that was put in the chat. So Matt, what AEP approval process was required to complete the HFO injection, and how long did it take for the AEP to approve this?
So the AEP approval process, we just basically had meetings with them prior to moving on to the pilot scale testing. And I believe it was about 3 different discussions over a course of a couple months while we were doing the bench scale testing. That was just to get their buy-in on it, but we also had to go through, due to some injections near the aquatic receiving environment, we went through a Water Act authorization form for the drilling of the wells. So that was the major holdup, was getting that, and that was, I think, about up to a 10-month process, and that really helped to kind of drive on the timelines for when we could get out there, and helped us set up when we should do bench scale and then when we should do the pilot. So yeah.
Right on. Thank you. Trevor, we do have a question for you. The question is whether a developer would benefit from creating their own Class 2 temporary storage sites.
Yeah, so I think that Class 2, sorry, can you just repeat the question?
The question is whether a developer would benefit from creating their own Class 2 temporary storage sites.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Class 2 temporary storage sites, like, they seem like a great solution for developers to manage soils between multiple properties, but I guess property values are a concern. So, sorry, just give me a sec here. Yeah, essentially, property values could be a barrier to this solution. Like Class 1 sites might be a better option for temporary storage for the needs for developers. Although Class 2 sites could be established further away from a municipality where the real estate prices are lower. The intent of the ministry is to facilitate local reuse of the soils and within a municipality and reduce transportation and greenhouse gas emissions. So I do expect a lot of municipalities will create their own Class 2 sites, although I've heard that the City of Toronto is reluctant to establish a Class 2 site for the same reason, like high real estate values and the value that they would get from using a site as a Class 2 site. I've also heard that in BC, some developers have actually purchased landfills for this type of management activity. So I don't know if that's an option that could be explored here or whether it would be worthwhile here. But yeah, that's what I would say. I think I saw another question.
Yeah, Trevor, there's another question here for you. I'll read it out for the group. Do you have a sense of how much additional cost would be required to developers due to the new soil regs, and which areas will most costs be incurred?
Yeah, so I would say that most of the costs will come from the additional sampling requirements, but overall, all those activities that were listed in the planning requirements slide will take a bit of effort. Like essentially, I would say the level of effort might be similar to costs that you would see for a phase 1 or phase 1 and phase 2 kind of ballpark. And then there's also the end use site locations report. So there is a substantial amount of work here. And yeah, I would consider what your typical phase 1 and 2 costs and maybe add some more on that just because of the length of the process as well. And it also depends on the effort that you would need to put into applying site-specific standards, or if you could just go with a one of the generic types of standards and the volumes required. So it will the effort will vary depending on the volume of soil and the amount of sampling that needs to be done. But yeah, it will be a significant cost.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. Another question. What steps and considerations would be required for developers to facilitate moving soils from a property with excess soils to another property that they own with a soil deficit?
Sorry, I'm just rereading the question. So I think that if they're planning to move to a soil from a property to that has a soil deficit, I guess it depends if it's a developer-owned property as well, and it'll depend on the volume of soils that they're planning to move. Again, there's the triggers that I had talked about were kind of like 2,000 meters cubed for notification, 10,000 meters cubed for some of the other large-scale activities, and so essentially you're looking at yeah, like you have to determine how much soil you're going to be moving this first, because there's a lot of quantity drivers, and so if it's less than 350 meters cubed, then you fall under that, and then it's fairly easily, unless it's a contaminated site, in which case, if it's a potentially contaminated site, you still have to follow all the planning requirements. So it's probably a question that would be better answered with some of the site specifics if for a particular scenario. But yeah, a lot of it just depends on the volumes and the ownership of the different sites. So I would say that.
Excellent. Okay, so go ahead.
I did see another question here.
Okay,
when you say excess soil is a defined term, does that mean any cut site? So excess soil is essentially, there is a prescribed definition for it, and yeah, it would include any cut site, and it would also include any soil that's being transported to off-site, essentially, like soil that's not necessarily needed on site, and you're trying to find a home for that soil. The goal of the ministry is eventually to prevent that soil from going to landfills, and also to make sure that it's viewed as a resource and they find a beneficial reuse for it, and they want to try and facilitate that locally within a municipality. So yeah, essentially any fill that you're planning to, or any soil that you're planning to transport off site would fall into this category, unless it's going to a landfill because it's highly contaminated, or to a hazardous waste facility because it's really highly contaminated.
Any more questions for Trevor? You got any there, Trevor?
I don't see any more, no.
So I guess we can open it up if anyone has any questions for any of our speakers in BC or Alberta. Oh, I've got a question here related to BC. So the question is that soil relocation is also a challenge in BC, and arsenic and sodium have become an issue. Is there any news on this? So pass that to Carrie or Jason.
I don't see Carrie there. Yeah, background arsenic and sodium are a problem for sure. I think there's no updates as of yet, basically, but it's something that apparently the ministry is looking at. And that's all I can really say. In the interim, avoid sampling for arsenic and sodium on your sites unless you're an arsenic mine or near the foreshore. But unfortunately, those problems aren't yours alone, and the ministry is looking at it, but there's no timeline, which means if you have an arsenic or a sodium issue on your site as background, unfortunately, you're going to have to deal with it.
I have one quick thing I could add. We did have a site on the island with those issues, particularly arsenic in this case. And the ministry, there's a test you can do. It's a leachate test, and it's a costly test. But when it's successful, which it was in this particular case, the result was the soil was actually not contaminated, and it could be relocated to a fill site at a significant overall reduction in cost. So although the test is a little costly to do up front, it does it has the potential to save a ton of money, no pun intended, on the disposal side. So that's one option that is currently available, and like Jason said, the ministry is still trying to figure out how to solve the other issues.
Awesome, thanks, Carrie. Any other questions? No. Looks like that's it. Trevor, you got one?
No, I don't have one, but I'll just add some clarification for one of the other questions that people had on costs. So when I was talking about the costs for doing all the planning and all the sampling and all that kind of stuff, I was kind of relating the answer to phase 1 and phase 2s, and I just wanted to iterate some phase 1 and phase 2s are very inexpensive if you're just doing 3 locations and whatnot, but some phase 2s are extremely expensive depending on the size and the issues, the complexity of the site. So just bear that in mind, that I am expecting quite a range in costs. And I think that if you were compared probably the sampling effort required for a large volume site before the regs and post introduction to the regs, like I'd say that it could double or triple your sampling and analysis costs, like the sampling minimums for large volume sites. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that question, my response to that question a bit.
Great, thanks, Trevor. Yeah, so Carol, I think flip to the next slide there, just with our contact details. I don't see any more questions in the feed, so I think we can wrap up a couple minutes early, but here is contact information for the speakers today. If you have any questions related to the regulatory updates in BC, you can reach out to Carrie and Jason. Any questions about your sites in Alberta, reach out to Matt Beveridge, and of course, Trevor in Ontario. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us this morning, and we'll let you know when we're having the next one.